Okay, good afternoon. We are starting now. On August 26, 2011, Abuja woke up to an explosion that shook its core. A car bomb struck the United Nations headquarters in Nigeria's capital. 21 people were killed and dozens more were injured. For many Nigerians, that moment showed clearly that Boko Haram was no longer a distant insurgency in the northeast. It had reached the political center of the country, announced itself to the international community, and made clear that this was a national crisis. However, that moment was not the beginning. Boko Haram had emerged years earlier in northeastern Nigeria, drawing on local grievances, religious movements, and a deep breakdown of trust between communities and the state. The violence escalated sharply after 2009 upon the extrajudicial execution of the founder and has since evolved across borders and factions. Just 10 days ago, on March 16th, 3 suicide bombers struck Maiduguri in coordinated attacks. One stood at the entrance of the University of Maiduguri Teaching Hospital, the other at Monday Market, and the third at the post office area, just as residents were breaking their Ramadan fast. At least 23 people were killed and over 100 more were injured. Since inception, Boko Haram and its offshoots have directly killed over 30,000 people. At about the same time, rural banditry, another form of violence, deepened in the northwest. What began as cattle rustling transformed into organized armed networks. Now kidnappings have moved from isolated incidents to a widespread strategy. These dynamics have historical roots, but their current scale and organization are different. Their weapons have become more sophisticated, and their networks are now even way more structured. The effects of this crisis extend far beyond the immediate sites of violence. So when we speak of Boko Haram and banditry, we are speaking about the character of the Nigerian state itself and how violence embeds itself in our political and economic life. We are asking who governs, who protects, who benefits, and who is left exposed. And we are also asking how external actors fit into this picture. On Christmas Day 2025, the United States launched Tomahawk missile strikes targeting terrorist camps in Sokoto State, marking its first direct kinetic intervention in Nigeria's conflict. By February 2026, 200 US troops arrived to train and advise the Nigerian military. These interventions raise harder questions about what outsiders can realistically solve and what remains fundamentally a question of domestic political order. As I was thinking about what to say today, I found myself asking, what can I say that you have not already heard? Many of you have read the literature, you have followed the headlines, and perhaps even studied these dynamics directly. And there is a risk that conversations like these become repetitions of familiar diagnoses and familiar frustrations. So instead, I thought to implore you that as you think about your research, whatever your field, that you do not treat Nigeria's issues as a distant case. Instead, you treat this as a life question about Nigeria's future, about governance that is under pressure, about the limits of external intervention, and about how states recover or fail to recover from sustained insecurity. There is room for discouragement in confronting these realities. It will be unrealistic to deny that. In fact, there's also room for pessimism as an intellectual position, but we must not allow pessimism to close the inquiry. Let us have the willingness to ask harder questions, to refine categories, and to remain open to outcomes that are not yet visible to us. If we do this well, we will live today not with easy answers, but with better questions and sharper ways of thinking about problems that resist simplification. It is my great honor to welcome to Stanford University and to the Hoover Institution our distinguished speakers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ebenezer Obadare from the Council on Foreign Relations, Deputy Director General Daniels from the UN International Organization for Migration, and lastly, Ambassador Robin Renee Sanders, one-time US Ambassador to Nigeria and CEO of Feeds and Feeds LLC. We are very fortunate to have with us 3 distinguished speakers whose experience span security, policy, and international governance, and whose perspectives speak directly to the questions we are here to consider. Our first speaker, Dr. Obadare, is a Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. Before joining CFR, he was a professor of sociology at the University of Kansas Lawrence. Dr. Obadare is the author of numerous works on civil society and the states and religion and politics in Africa, and we are very glad to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Ebenezer Obadare.
Honor to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm honored by the invitation to be part of today's proceedings and deeply grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts on the unfolding security situation in Nigeria, particularly the deteriorating security situation in the northern half of the country. My marching orders from GIFT are straightforward enough: to place Nigeria's chronic and seemingly intractable insecurity challenges within its proper socio-historical context, to situate them within the crisis of the Nigerian state, to trace the various subdivisions of that crisis as they manifest and are complicated within regional and political context, and lastly, to examine and analyze the nascent collaboration between the Trump administration and the Nigerian authorities aimed at neutralizing the Islamist insurgency, making sure to tease out some of the critical questions and problems arising from it. On that note, the most appropriate point of departure is to acknowledge the simple but depressing fact that beyond banditry and jihadism, both rightly the focus of this symposium, Nigeria is generally not a safe country and, truth be told, hasn't been for some time now. This does not mean that on a good day you couldn't make your way from one part of the country to another, as many continue to do regardless of the hazards involved. What it does mean is that there's a safety formula that most Nigerians have internalized and around which bitter experience has taught them to arrange their daily lives as follows. Daytime is generally safer than nighttime. Urban centers are generally more secure than the countryside, with the spiral of insecurity widening the more distant you are from the city centers, in part because the further away you are from the cities, the shallower and less assured the rate of the state. Furthermore, the nature of everyday insecurity you are exposed to can vary depending on where and, most important, who you are. Lastly, because as anthropologist Daniel Jordan Smith memorably puts it, every Nigerian household is its own government, individuals and families have devised various innovative strategies to cater for their own security. Accordingly, when, for example, you come across the unsettling statistic that a quarter of Nigeria's entire police force is deployed exclusively to service very important personalities, VIPs, and their families, the most productive way to see that is as an elite manifestation of the privatization of security, a phenomenon that every Nigerian household is familiar with and willy-nilly must become adept at, and one that explains the surplus of vigilante groups in many rural areas. How should we understand this chronic and pervasive insecurity? And how can an apprehension of its genealogy and contours illuminate Nigeria's contemporary condition? This question cannot be meaningfully answered without attention to the basic identity of the Nigerian state, forged in the manner of majority of its post-colonial African peers in the barrel of a musket. Insofar as it continues to bear the mark of its original conception, it is because, rather than dismantle the apparatus of coercion that they inherited from the colonizers, post-independence elites quickly learned to turn the same against an array of real and imagined enemies. In time, and as the initial promise of self-rule yielded to the trauma and disillusionment of military rule, violence became the essential lubricant of the post-colonial political machine. For decades, a succession of military rulers would take turns in schooling Nigerians in the language of violence. Even today, a quarter of a century after the military was forced to relinquish the reins and return to the barracks, the legacy of that era of impunity and violence continues to echo in the militarization of both the grammar and practice of politics. For those who desire to be regaled with examples, and I'm not selling a book here, an entire chapter of my book, Pentecostal Republic, is devoted to the phenomenon. It's available on Amazon, by the way. In retrospect, the most important and definitely most consequential legacy of military rule was the creation of an omnipotent central state, which has grown unduly strong in inverse proportion to the weakness of the federating subunits. The ultimate prize in what remains essentially a system of political patronage organized around the distribution of oil proceeds, the Nigerian state is strangely capable and feckless at the same time. Chronically lacking in the vital attributes of statehood, it has a knack for suddenly turning into an inexorable force in the pursuit of its antagonists. What is expected for it statutorily, the Nigerian state shies away from, and what it should abstain from, it pursues with uncanny vigor. Its mobilization of violence is a case in point. One thing that immediately strikes a visitor to Nigeria is the raw impunity and total lack of regard with which law enforcement relates to the very citizens they are sworn to protect. For a category of Nigerian, typically a member of the social underclass, so I want you to think about your public transport driver, passengers, students, hairstylists, auto mechanics, tailors, traders, artisanal apprentices of all stripes. Nothing is more dreaded than the prospect of a random encounter with the Nigerian police. The average Nigerian expects contact with the police to be either uncivil at best or lethal at worst, and the police rarely disappoint. By Human Rights Watch estimate, police shoot and kill an average of 1,400 Nigerians annually. This appalling record and frustration at perceived official insensitivity was the main trigger for the 2017 NSAS nationwide protest against police brutality, which by December 2020 gained global notoriety because of unabating police abuse. Nevertheless, while the police are regularly brutish in their treatment of ordinary Nigerians, it should be remembered that police violence is hardly exceptional. If anything, and this is the rub for me, it is just one aspect of a state of deregulated violence in which most Nigerians are deeply imbricated. I'm referencing here a banality of incivility that stretches from violence between different arms of law enforcement, such as the army versus the police, on the one hand, to various forms of domestic violence on the other. I'm sure some of the young Nigerian women here will testify to what I've just said. Granted, there's a world of difference between a police officer frog marching an innocent bus driver on the one hand, and a band of insurgents sacking a community and taking survivors hostage on the other. Besides, and I'm going to have more to say about this in short order, not every bandit or jihadist is a frustrated political dissident, in the same way that not every example of organized violence is a legitimate candidate for political recognition. My point, on the contrary, is that it makes little sense to approach chronic insecurity in Nigeria without taking into account the reality of a central state long accustomed to a recourse to force to pursue its aims, a civil society similarly schooled in the language of violence, and a normative matrix whereby an understanding of coercion as an acceptable means of advancing claims, legitimate or otherwise, prevails. With these preliminary clarifications and caveats appropriately established, I now turn to the regional character of insecurity in Nigeria. As I stated before, how you experience insecurity in Nigeria is often determined by your location on the social ladder. Crucially, too, insecurity in the country is geographically delineated. I shall begin with the Western region. While Nigerians everywhere can count on police molestation at random checkpoints, the overriding threats to security in the western part of the country emanate from armed robbery and kidnapping. Ever since the conclusion of the Civil War in 1970, when small arms and light weapons from the 3-year conflict ended up in the wrong hands, armed robbery has become a perennial problem across the country. As a matter of fact, it is worth recalling that the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS, the infamous bugbear of young protesters in December 2020, had been established almost 3 decades earlier in late 1992 at the height of a spate of armed robbery attacks across the country. Kidnapping, on the other hand, and as far as the western part of the country is concerned, at a map of Nigeria, is mostly a politics-free crime of opportunity orchestrated by disaffected youngsters and criminal elements desperate to profit from the uncertainty produced by the overall breakdown of law and order in the country. Kidnapping, too, is vintage, though the latest wave arguably traces back to the social unrest in the Niger Delta region of the country. There, what began as a legitimate agitation for self-determination and a demand for corporate social accountability from oil multinationals slowly unraveled into criminality and political gamesmanship, following the hanging of writer and environmental rights advocate Ken Saro-Wiwa by the military state in November 1995. If kidnapping in the region started as a way of extorting ransom from the well-heeled expatriate class by organized criminal gangs and pirates, it soon diffused slowly to the rest of the country. For example, it is part of the modus operandi of Islamist groups and bandit elements in northern Nigeria. Although their systematic targeting of young women suggests that kidnapping in the region is as much about the economy of ransom as it is about rape, forced marriage, and forced conversion. I should note in parentheses that the amnesty program initiated by the Yar'Adua administration, which provided the basis for the disbandment of various militia groups and the incorporation of their leaders into the political establishment, coupled with their subsequent emergence as big men in their own right, have brought relative peace and stability to the Niger Delta region. Just like in the Niger Delta, the character of insecurity in the southeast region is not unconnected to the agitation for self-determination. In this case of the Igbos, one of Nigeria's three historically dominant ethnic majority groups, motivated on the one hand by anger at the rough justice supposedly meted to the Igbos during the Civil War, that's 1967 to 70, and on the other by the frustration at the group's apparent continued subordination in the Nigerian Federation, Igbo self-determination has helped and flowed for most of Nigeria's post-Civil War history. The emergence of secessionist-minded groups like the Movement for the Actualization of the Sovereign State of Biafra, MASOB, and latterly the Indigenous People of Biafra, IPOB, while capturing the imagination of a cross-section of the Igbo urban underclass, seems to have deepened friction between members of the groups and law enforcement, leading to a noticeable spike in the volume of violent encounters and rapid breakdown of law and order. In any event, continuing tension and contention among a variety of unidentified armed groups, private militias, and state-sponsored vigilante groups, all of whom have been plausibly accused of involvement in extrajudicial killings at various times, has led to a significant blurring of the line between legitimate political agitation and criminal conduct. With last November's conviction on terrorism charges of IPOB leader Nnamdi Kanu, a decision that, unsurprisingly, has not gone down well with his supporters, there's every reason to expect the situation across the region to remain on edge for the foreseeable future. Which then leaves us with the northern and central regions of the country, where, if you've been following developments, the debate on how to characterize and explain the violence has been as bitter and protracted as the actual mayhem. The way I see it, the intellectual challenge is to meaningfully separate pure banditry, where such exists, from violence unleashed by Islamic insurgency groups, which have grown in confidence since the first wave of attacks by Boko Haram in 2009. From a certain perspective, everything will seem to rest on getting this distinction right. If, for instance, the problem in the region is that of mere banditry, then it's all about taking the right policy steps to neutralize the threat. Besides, banditry being as old as the northern region of Nigeria itself, one can then take assurance in the fact that we are confronted with a challenge that is familiar to policymakers, its recent escalation notwithstanding. Whatever one may think of bandits and the unbecoming arrogance of the most storied outlaws, at least we know that the solution lies in taking the battle to them, flushing them out of their hideouts, and closing the gaps in the security system they might be exploiting. At least so goes the thinking. The calculation changes if, on the contrary, the core problem is not banditry, but jihadist terror, in which case bandit elements and criminal groups are only taking advantage of the lawlessness and disorder caused by the operations of jihadist elements. At the same time, if jihadism is the cause and heightened banditry mainly one of its many downstream effects, policy attention must remain focused on the cause, eliminate the insurgency, and the swamp in which banditry has festered is automatically drained. The theory that social breakdown across northern Nigeria is an outcome of the operations of bandits with a coherent political grievance, and that any reference to jihadist terror and its explicitly religious motivation amounts to Islamophobia has many champions, not least some influential northern clerics who insist that such banditry is a function of, quote, systematic marginalization, poverty, and historical grievances, unquote, hence not susceptible to, quote and unquote, a military solution. On that basis, they have called for amnesty for the bandits, quote, the same way that it was granted to Niger Delta militants, unquote. As I will show presently, apart from deliberately mischaracterizing the security crisis in northern Nigeria, this perspective also misjudges the drivers of the Islamist insurgency and the policy approach needed to arrest it. As I've tried to show in my writings, and most recently in my testimony to the House Appropriations Committee on this matter, not only is the security crisis in the northern and central regions of Nigeria first and last about Islamism, crucially, it is impossible to understand insurgency, talk less, design appropriate policy response to it without admitting its essential religious predication. That a chronic security crisis in the Nigerian Muslim heartland will contain a religious element should hardly be surprising. If anything, it goes to validate one key axiom of scholarship on Nigeria to the extent that you cannot hope to understand this major phenomena without attention to religion, particularly in its dynamic interlockings with region and ethnicity. If that is the case, a decades-long Islamist insurgency without a religious component will be hard indeed, hard enough to make it the first jihadist uprising in the world of its kind. The irony is that Nigerian jihadist groups, chiefly Boko Haram, but increasingly splinter groups like JNM, ISWAP, have never been shy about their religiously charged raison d'etre to abolish the Nigerian state, iconic as it were of a modernity which they find deeply repulsive, and to replace it with a Sharia-based Islamic theocracy. It makes it all the more remarkable that the more vigorously these Islamist groups have canvassed their theological objectives, often with ugly candor, the more eagerly a section of the commentariat has stepped forward to portray them as disaffected subalterns desperate for good governance, fair elections, and democratic representation. Now, granted, it is easy to understand the appeal of the idea that bandits are what someone called victims driven to violence by government neglect. As previously stated, banditry, characterized by various forms of criminal violence, including cattle rustling, abductions for rape, ransom, armed robbery, and village raids, has a long history in northern Nigeria, especially across the northwestern corridor of the country. At the same time, and to make further concession to the argument, there is no question about poverty in the northern region, especially in relation to the southern part. According to the Nigerian National Bureau of Statistics, 65% of the poor and less educated live in the northern region of the country. Even so, the critical questions, one, whether bandit violence is motivated by political grievance, and ipso facto, two, whether an amnesty program similar to the one largely successfully implemented in the Niger Delta is applicable to the north, do not necessarily go away. Unfortunately, and in spite of the ardor of its advocates, there seems to be scant evidence that the so-called bandits have a genuine political grievance. In the first place, if they do, it is yet to be as clearly and openly articulated as their religious motivations. Other than the remonstrations of others on their behalf, a sincere observer of the situation across the northwestern region has little to go by in terms of a systematic case for political disenfranchisement. For ostensible subalterns who have had various opportunities to speak up, the silence from the bandits is rather curious. Indeed, it is not that the subaltern doesn't speak. It is that their speech is aimed at an Islamist agenda rather than any political grievance. This is what makes the analogy with the Niger Delta situation so fundamentally misconceived. Beyond the element of violence in both cases, there's scant basis for comparison between banditry in northern Nigeria and agitation for equitable allocation of oil proceeds in the Niger Delta. For instance, so far as we know, there is no northern equivalent of Kensarowiwa. For any comparison between northern Nigeria and the Niger Delta to be plausible, we need to see proof of legitimate political grievance in the Northwest. Part of the reason why it was possible for the administration of Musa Yar'Adua to initiate amnesty for Niger Delta militants, and why violence across the region has subsequently subsided, is that even when the violence was extreme, the underlying political grievance was never far from view. The contrast does not end there. The Niger Delta militants never engaged in mass atrocities or killing of civilians the way the bandits have done in the north. Nor did they, that is the Niger Delta militants, ever say anything about wanting to institute or impose any religious ideology on the rest of the country. In light of the foregoing, the issue is not whether contemporary violence in northern Nigeria is motivated by religion. The real question, to my mind, is the identified reluctance of Western commentators and especially local apologists in northern Nigeria to admit and pursue it. In any event, this is the socio-political fray into which the US is stepping, and I crave your indulgence to close my remarks with an overview of some of the critical matters arising from its collaboration with the Nigerian authorities. In this respect, the first knot to untangle is to explain the interest of the Trump White House in Nigerian affairs. The most plausible answer is that for the Trump administration, Nigeria presents a great opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, move against resurgent Islamic terrorist activity, and at the same time, attend to the welfare of its Christian victims. It is notable that an administration otherwise reputed for its distraction has held steady due to the doggedness of Christian advocacy groups in Washington and elements within an increasingly influential Nigerian diaspora. On the Nigerian side, decision makers seem wary of incurring the displeasure of a US president who has shown that he is not unwilling to crack the whip if necessary. At the same time, they are not exactly unhappy to receive external help against an insurgency that has broken the back of successive Nigerian governments and whose continued operations risk making the incumbent administration look ineffectual and feckless. This perhaps explains the manner in which the Nigerian authorities have responded to US pressure. In addition to collaborating with the US Africa Command, AFRICOM, in undertaking reconnaissance prior to the Christmas Day 2025 bombardment of suspected terrorist bases and targets in the northwest region of the country, the Nigerian government has announced a series of measures intended to strengthen its military operations against insurgents specifically and the country's security system more generally. These include restructuring the military leadership, ordering the immediate withdrawal of police officers moonlighting with VIPs, and boosting the police by recruiting 30,000 additional police personnel. On the American side, success or failure will be determined to a large extent by the kind of reception accorded US personnel, something that for its part will ultimately boil down to public perception of the mission. In that regard, the fact that the latest moves appear to have been coordinated and executed with the imprimatur of the Nigerian authorities is a good omen. Although President Trump was the first to announce the Christmas Day airstrikes on his social media account, subsequent confirmation from the Nigerian External Affairs Ministry that the bombings were a joint operation and part of ongoing structured security cooperation with the US to eliminate terror threats quickly allayed fears of American unilateral action. Furthermore, following criticism of the Christmas Day military action as having achieved little due to its being based on outdated intelligence, it was the Nigerian Defense Minister, Christopher Musa, who clarified that it had helped in driving Lakurawa, an offshoot of the Islamic State, back across the country's northwestern border with Niger. US intervention has also been welcomed by other segments of the Nigerian society, including major media outlets. One-time Senate leader Aileen Dume has called for further action in the exclusive strongholds of the Islamic State West African province in the country's northeastern region. Others have expressed reservations about which the US only overlooks at its own peril. Now, President Trump has conveyed the impression that American presence in Nigeria is motivated by a desire to rescue Nigerian Christians whom his administration believes is facing an existential threat due to persistent attacks by Islamist insurgents. At the same time, various pro-Christian advocacy groups have played a prominent role in creating awareness around the plight of Christian victims of Boko Haram, especially in the central region of the country. While it is not incorrect to say that Nigerian Christians are being killed, in truth, the victims of Boko Haram and other insurgent groups cut across the religious spectrum. The idea that the United States, a Christian country in many northern Nigerian minds, may be crusading, I'm using that word deliberately, on behalf of Nigerian Christians is bound to ruffle the social matter in a predominantly Muslim segment of the country. Key northern Islamic leaders and clerics have already accused the United States of harboring a hidden agenda, while others have demanded that the Nigerian authorities halt all military cooperation with the US because of the US's apparent military tendencies, imperial tendencies. The longer the US military personnel remain on ground in the region, the more likely that these voices will get louder. A section of the Nigerian commentariat has questioned whether American help for the Nigerian military is a ruse intended to mask Washington's ostensible desperation to seize the country's oil installations, pointing first to recent U.S. military exploits in Venezuela, where U.S. forces captured former President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in January, and second, America's relentless pursuit of critical minerals under the Trump presidency. While the accusation may sound far-fetched, there's thus far no evidence of American troop deployment in the southern oil region of Nigeria, and it seems unlikely that the Nigerian government will sanction such a move. What is important from an American standpoint is that the suspicion betrays a long-held apprehension about American geopolitical calculations in Africa, which includes misgivings about Nigerian breakup, widely believed to have been predicted by Americans. While the White House can always point to the fact that it is in Nigeria at the pleasure of the Nigerian authorities, prudence lies in recognizing these underlying tensions and the reality that things can change very quickly. Of importance in this regard is the question of how the US defines the battlefield opposition in Nigeria. As already discussed, a view of the insurgency as a product of a crisis of governance, whose cure is to be sought in appropriate political remedies, remains popular in certain quarters. This overlooks the all-important theocratic impulse, as I've been pursuing, behind the Islamist movement and the fact that political intervention is redundant unless the immediate military threat is nullified. Direct American assistance to Nigeria rightly recognizes the need to militarily engage with various terror groups responsible for as many as 300,000 fatalities and more than 2.3 million people displaced in the outbreak in 2009. That said, it should be remembered that part of the reason why these groups have kept going is because of their honest ideological conviction, something that American involvement in Nigeria may very well end up stoking. Not only is it important for the US to see the insurgency for the ideological phenomenon that it undeniably is, as well, Washington's actions in Nigeria must be seen as part of a campaign to combat and defeat violent extremism across the Sahel more broadly. The Pentagon is in the wrong place if it supposes that this is a conflict it can enter into while hoping to avoid any long-term presence or commitment. The Nigerian military will pose its own problems. Highly unprofessional and corrupt to the nth degree, collaboration with it will be a test of patience for the US Armed Forces. In the past, the Nigerian military has faced accusations of giving outdated or false intelligence to the United States. More worryingly, Nigerian soldiers have been previously accused of leaking intelligence about planned operations to extremists. All this means that the US finds itself in an alliance with a partner whose interest and sincerity it must continually second guess. Finally, given what we know about how endemic instability both fuels and feeds off extremism, it goes without saying that military engagement without commensurate investment in shoring up Nigeria's democratic foundation, the same point applies to other African countries racked with extreme violence. Military engagement without commensurate investment in shoring up democratic foundation will ultimately amount to a waste of effort and resources. The Trump administration's decision not to comment on the fairness or integrity of most elections, which is one element of its explicit disavowal of liberalism, makes such an investment difficult to countenance. I hope the foregoing synopsis gives you a sense of the social and political complexity of Nigeria's insecurity crisis. Once again, I'm grateful for the invitation and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Badari, for this brilliant lecture and also offering us a solid foundation to have the rest of the speakers. Our second speaker has come all the way from the UN headquarters in Switzerland to be with us today. Ms. Ugochi Daniels is the Deputy Director General of the International Organization for Migration, IOM. As one of the most senior leaders of the UN system's principal intergovernmental organization on migration, she brings to this symposium the operational perspective of an institution working directly with the communities affected. Her work sits at the intersection of forced displacement, humanitarian response, and long-term stabilization, and we are pleased to have her expert perspective on this topic. Please welcome DDG Ugochi Daniels.
Thank you very much, Gift. It's a pleasure to be here, joined by such distinguished fellow panelists. So Professor Obadare spoke about his marching orders. I have similar marching orders, but I also have my own objectives in speaking with all of you today. One of which is understanding what a UN migration agency does. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of IOM before or come into contact with IOM, so that's one. I'd also like to use this opportunity to dispel some very convenient notions or ideas about what displacement is and what it's not, and obviously through the lens of what's happening in Nigeria. But most important of all is that I want to give you some ideas about what you can and should be doing. Well, I want to give you some ideas about what should and can be done in Nigeria, and therefore, from your vantage point, what you can focus on, whether it's your research, your advocacy, your engagement, including through social media, and how you mobilize within your networks. So in the Q&A, you can tell me if I achieved my objectives or not. But let me start off. I have a couple of, let's see, I have a couple of slides, yeah. I was in Nigeria 2 times last year, looking at our operations and obviously speaking with the government, speaking with other UN agencies, most important of all, speaking with people and families who have been displaced. So and I have pictures to kind of animate the remarks I'm going to make, and they all come from the Bay Area, so Borno State, Adamawa State, Yobe State, as well as Benue. So the first notion I want to address is the fact around is displacement temporary, and what all of you understand as displacement. So maybe I'll start off with a question, which is, how do you see, what comes to your mind first when you think of displacement? So I mentioned that I met with families, I met with people who were displaced. What do you think is the first thing that is characteristic of their displacement?
I think of like shacks where they have to, like temporary housing where they have to live in for the time being.
Okay, that's true. Anything?
Involuntary?
Beg your pardon?
Involuntary?
Involuntary, you meaning
Yeah,
forced.
displacement,
They
yeah.
didn't have any. Very true. Yes?
Psychological trauma, not wanting to go back even if it seems safe.
Absolutely. So all of this is correct. What I want to add to it, however, is that it's not temporary. What has become very characteristic in Nigeria is that it is not a temporary disruption or an episodic shock. It's a persistent condition that structures how millions of Nigerians, particularly in the Northeast, how they live, move, and how they survive. So as IOM, we're the UN Migration Agency. What does that mean? It means that we're involved in all aspects of how and why and where people move. And we want people to move safely, with dignity, and in an orderly way. And obviously, displacement is the exact opposite of that. And one of the things we do is we track displacement all around the world. And in the case of Nigeria, Nigeria has almost 4 million people who are displaced, specifically 3.7 million people, largely driven by conflict, but also climate change. In the previous map, you would have seen, you saw Lake Chad, but the reality is 90% of Lake Chad has dried up. And this reality matters because unless we are honest about it, our policies will be, however well intended or crafted, they're going to fall short of the lived experience of displaced people. So from IOM's perspective, Nigeria is not facing a displacement crisis that's going to resolve itself with time stabilization plans or administrative efforts. What Nigeria is dealing with is prolonged mobility reality driven by sustained violence and banditry from non-state armed groups as well as from farmer-herder clashes, weak and uneven governance, climate pressure, and deep socioeconomic inequality. So just a few statistics to put some numbers behind this. Where do you think we rank in terms of fatalities from terrorism?
Per capita?
No, just in terms of list of countries.
Like number or per capita?
No. Are we first, second, third, fourth?
Yeah,
Where do
but
we
what,
rank?
what are you measuring?
Number of deaths.
Per capita number of deaths?
No, just number of deaths. First. We had the largest increase last year, 46%. And of course, Gift had already spoken about what had happened most recently in Maiduguri. And when I was in Nigeria, I was there just after the events. My first visit was just after what had happened in Benue State, where about over 200 people were killed. And going back to the point that I made, that these are not episodes. This is a structural way of life and a structural component of displacement. Not surprisingly, Nigeria, we have among the youngest, as a country, we're among the youngest in the world, median age just over 18 years, and more than half under 30. Now, before working for the UN Migration Agency, I used to work for the UN Population Agency. One of the things we always advocated for is how countries can take advantage of a very youthful population and how a youthful population can spur socioeconomic growth. And yet, despite the opportunity of its youthful population, youth unemployment in Nigeria is almost among the highest in the world at 55%. So I've already talked about high displacement numbers. I've talked about deaths due to terrorism, now youth unemployment. And not surprisingly, we know that farmer-herder violence continues to be a major driver of displacement. Now, Nigeria remains, actually this was my youth, supposedly my youth, should have been what we want to see young people doing, right? Livelihoods. All of these, the people that you see here are people who have been displaced, and one of the ways in which we support their eventual returns is to build skills for sustainable livelihoods. Now, Nigeria is one of Africa's most flood-prone countries, and in 2024, floods affected people across 33 states. And the flooding season, apart from devastating communities, there's damage to infrastructure, crops, shelters, which is why so many people are in. So temporary shelter, I find it as a difficult term, because temporary shelter is like, this is where you go temporarily and move back. When we're talking about temporary shelter, the temporariness is about the materials of the shelter. So many of them are in tents. Many of them just have tarpaulin sheets. That's why it's temporary. Not because they're there temporarily, but the shelter that they have, maximum 2-3 months is the durability of the shelter. Obviously, then this also, in the context of flooding, we have disruptions in food markets, disruptions in supplies of food. We also saw that floodwaters destroyed all of the household items. So I've talked a bit about the context as it relates to the situation with insecurity, and also from the perspective of climate change. So now going back to the point about insecurity is structural and not episodic, we often hear about insecurity being framed as a sequence of events: attacks, floods, clashes, or incidents of insurgency. For IOM, we consider this framing as misleading. What our data shows consistently is that insecurity is not an episode, it's structural. It's no longer an interruption to daily life, it is the context in which daily life now unfolds for millions of people. Similarly, displacement is not temporary, it's protracted by design and by default. When insecurity persists year after year, displacement ceases to be an emergency phase. We often talk about an emergency phase of 3 or 6 months. When it comes to insecurity, it is persistent and becomes a governing condition that shapes housing, livelihoods, education, and social cohesion. And this means that the traditional humanitarian approach of emergency recovery and development does not map neatly with the reality that we have in Nigeria. And so for many displaced Nigerians, there is no clear transition point between crisis and recovery. There is simply adaptation to ongoing risk. And in turn, and as we discussed earlier, internal displacement is rarely a one-time experience. Our displacement tracking shows that many households have been displaced 2, 3, even 4 times in just a year. And these movements are often short distance within the same state or region, reflecting efforts to manage the risk rather than permanently relocate. Now, this matters analytically because it challenges the assumption that displacement naturally ends when people return. Many displaced Nigerians are not refusing to go home. They're simply waiting for conditions that make return survivable. In many locations, those conditions, security services, housing, land, livelihoods, simply do not exist. So for example, only 11% of schools nationwide have access to basic water, sanitation, and hygiene services. In the northeastern region where I visited, unless IOM or other humanitarian actors are trucking in water, there is no access. There is no access to water, to clean water. So, biggest barrier to return: insecurity, absence of basic services, including schools, health, water, sanitation, hygiene, unresolved land and property issues, lack of viable livelihoods compounded by climate shock and destroyed infrastructure. So, I don't know how familiar you are following some of the moves particularly at the state government level. So because the situation in whether it's IDP camps or, in Nigeria, we now have the term garrison towns. So the garrison towns are where you have some type of military installation. It could be a battalion, it could be military barracks. And Professor Obadare had spoken about the point that the further you go from the city areas, the further you are away from the presence of government. So people, when seeking safety in these areas, go to garrison towns where they feel there is safety by presence of the military or the camps. Obviously, people in the camps or people going into garrison towns are in horrible, horrible conditions. I met with the governor of Borno State, and he was very clear that his people are living in situations of squalor. It is not dignified. There are dens for prostitution, for arms smuggling, for drug smuggling. He wants them out of the camps. And so the camps were progressively shut down, and people were also relocated from garrison towns. Now, on the face of this, it is a good gesture to not want people to be living in those conditions, but only to the extent that you can assure them, that you can assure conditions better where you are moving them to. So what we saw is that returns are not safe and they are not solutions. They're being promoted in contexts where the insecurity still persists. The displacement sites were closed. People were being encouraged or pressured to leave, even when they were returning to unsafe or lack of basic social services. And let's keep in mind that in northwest and northeastern Nigeria, almost 6 million children are suffering from acute malnutrition. The picture you see here, again, this is humanitarian support, is more the exception than the norm. And the decision to return people when the conditions aren't there, for us, this is us meaning IOM. We don't just see this as a neutral policy choice, but it's a transfer of risk from institutions onto the individuals. And when people return prematurely, it doesn't mean that the risks disappear. It reemerges as renewed displacement. Remember, I said people are displaced often multiple times. Their vulnerability is deepened, or they move onward movement. So when return is not safe, voluntary, and dignified, it's not a long-lasting solution. It may reduce the visible numbers in the short term, but they increase instability in the medium and long term. And this is not a value judgment. This is what our data is telling us. So, what do you think? If people cross borders in this situation, is it a sign that internal systems aren't working? Or is it a smart way for people to manage risk? What do you think?
It looks like a combination of both.
What borders are we talking about here?
Any border. If you cross from, let's say, from Borno State into Niger or into Cameroon.
Yeah, but not Borno State into Yobe, something like that.
No, not state borders, cross borders, out of the country.
Isn't working. Like, I will lean more. It could be a mix of both, but I think there's also a risk with leaving where you stay, leaving like your support system. So I would imagine that people have probably like weighed those risks, and they're probably like, the systems where I am currently at just aren't working for me.
Seems like rational behavior in an irrational environment.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And from an IOM perspective, from a migration perspective, we see this as people managing the risks, that staying where they are without the necessary systems and support and livelihoods, that it's better for them to move elsewhere. Now, this dispels a notion that, I'm highlighting this to dispel a notion that crossing borders is an alarm sign. In many contexts, And as IOM, we monitor borders around the world. Many of the countries that fund us want to know when people are crossing borders. From IOM's perspective, we always underline that it is often a rational, adaptive risk management strategy that people do to seek safety, access livelihoods, join families, or cope with disruptions in their local economies. Also keeping in mind that in many of the countries, Nigeria is a classic example, the borders are artificial. The people on the other side of the border are oftentimes members of the same family, right? And I think our former late head of state, President Buhari, famously said he would, if Nigerians didn't like him, he would happily join his brothers, right, in Niger. So cross-border movement is a signal, not a failure. There's a persistent tendency to frame cross-border movements as evidence that something is wrong. But from our standpoint, this framing is wrong. When Nigerians cross into neighboring countries, they're not abandoning solutions. They're responding rationally to the limited options they have where they are. And similarly, when Nigerians return from neighboring countries into very fragile, risky environments, return should not be mistaken for a resolution. Mobility should be an indicator of misalignment between policy assumptions and the lived reality. Going back to the policy assumption that if you move people out of camps, move people out of garrison towns, you have come up with a permanent solution. Instead, what do we see? People moving into a secondary movement or crossing borders. Now, moving on to protection. So obviously, prolonged insecurity, repeated displacement create predictable protection risks. Women and children, young people make up the majority of displaced populations in Nigeria. Female-headed households are increasing. We've already heard about sexual violence. There are also issues of child marriage and child labor. And these are systemic risks in protracted displacement settings. Nigeria accounts for 10% of all survivors of gender-based violence globally and has the third highest prevalence of female genital mutilation worldwide. Now, the point I'm making here is that even before the issues of insecurity and displacement, we rank very high on survivors of sexual violence, on female genital mutilation, on early marriage. When you add displacement and you add violence, what do you think is going to happen? It's only going to get worse, right? And we should not be touting this as it's due to the crisis or it's due to displacement. These were underlying challenges that we had that have only worsened. So it is predictable. We should, and I'm including government here, should be factoring this in. It's not going, it can only get worse because it's often reported in the context of crisis and displacement, but it has to be put into the broader context, which also includes housing, land, and property disputes. These are core political and social barriers to reintegration or ending displacement. And as I mentioned, these are not accidental. They are foreseeable consequences of premature returns, unresolved security, and insufficient attention to the agency of people who are displaced. So, where do we sit on, or what do we think about long-term solutions as a responsibility of the government? Because a lot of the things I've spoken about are, from my perspective, technical, whether we're talking about better access to services, access to land, safety and security. These are all like sector-wide, sector-specific aspects of solutions. And to be honest, Nigeria has made progress in developing policy frameworks, and I want to recognize that. But do policy frameworks result in long-term solutions? Come on, people, we've got to have some ideas here.
If we have systems in place for those policies to actually be implemented, then I would assume that they should, in effect, be leading to like long-term changes. But I don't know that we enforce them well.
So that's a good summary of it. And here I'm launching Nigeria's strategic plan on long-term solutions last year. And we had, a whole range of ministers. We had the Chief of Defense Staff. We had quite a few stakeholders. And as I said, Nigeria has made progress on the policy side, and this needs to be acknowledged. However, without political commitment behind this, it's just a really lovely document. And Professor Obadare has explained very eloquently the, what's the word to use? The characteristics of our leadership, or the characteristics of the failure of our leadership. From a UN perspective, solutions are only achieved when the risks and vulnerabilities people face that drove them to displacement are no longer there. And by this standard, most displacement-affected areas in Nigeria remain very far from meeting this threshold. So in Nigeria, the gap between policy ambition and operational reality is the defining challenge. So what can be done? I don't want it to be all gloom and doom. And when I say I don't want it to be all gloom and doom, it's not because I want students here at Stanford to leave with hope and inspiration, but because I have spoken with people who have been impacted, because I've spoken with people who have had to choose between, do I feed my daughters or do I feed my sons? Do I stay with my husband or do I leave with my children? Do I sell my assets so I can take care of my family? Do I sell myself so I can take care of my family? That's why I want to talk about what can be done, because there are people who are making choices every single day that we would never be able to imagine, and who, if there's anything we can do to support, then we should be doing. And going back to what I said in my opening, what can be done from your vantage point? So, a couple of things. Community-led stabilization. It's a very technical term, but what it fundamentally means is at the local level. How are we ensuring support to communities? In every community, and for those of us from Nigeria, we know there are always community leaders. How are we engaging community leaders? How are we setting up local peace committees in whatever the local structure is? Early warning systems. Early warning systems is a very fancy term, but the women will tell you that they know when an attack is going to happen, because when they're fetching water, they see the movements. That's an early warning. That's a local early warning system. That's one. Another part of the solution is, how are we helping people adapt to the impact of climate? When, if I take the example of Lake Chad, where 90% of the water has dried up, how are we helping them with agriculture that's climate smart, dry season farming, diversified income opportunities? Another area. One thing we know is that people move. People move for different reasons. How can we, and we know that in this movement, particularly farmers, herders, and access to water and food for their livestock, how can we manage this movement in a way that is peaceful? Because there's no way we are ever going to stop herders from moving. And they're always going to move through farms. So how is that dynamic going to be managed in a way that is win-win on both sides? How are we putting young people at the center? How are we helping or supporting them with skills training, apprenticeship support, and leadership opportunities? There is so much that can be done online to advance this. How are we strengthening women's leadership? How are we supporting women-led cooperatives? How are we enabling women to have access to land? And you can see that all of these solutions that I'm talking about are centered around people. Because, again, we know from the data that it's peace and stability is local, and it's by the people. That is the long-term solution. And none of these things I've mentioned is rocket science, right? They're all doable. And we know, particularly in the case of our people in Nigeria, they're very, very resilient. They're very industrious. I have been in countries where, when I describe the ingenuity of, I've been in countries where, when I'm speaking to people who are displaced, their own understanding of a long-term solution is what they can get. Give me this number of items. When I speak to people in Benue State, when I speak to people in Adamawa State, they're asking for the opportunity to help themselves. They're not asking for more handouts. It's something really, really important to keep in mind. Of course, if we hand out things, they're going to take it, but that's not what they're looking for, and that's not long-term or sustainable. So I want to leave you with appreciating that displacement in Nigeria is not only about loss. That's an important aspect to it. That describes the drivers of migration, but it's about resilience, innovation, and the courage of millions who continue to rebuild regardless of the risks and vulnerabilities that they're dealing with. So if we match that courage they're demonstrating with policies that are rooted in reality, and that the solutions come from the communities themselves, then the future of the country can be one of recovery and not crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ugochi Daniels, for painting a clear picture for us, and also for this presentation that is from a closer perspective. And I suspect that many of you have questions. So we now want to open the floor to the room. Please wait. Please introduce yourself briefly and direct your question to a specific speaker or to the panel as a whole. And I want to kick us off with the questions. And I have a lot of questions for Dr. Obadare. in your presentation, you made it clear that defeating Boko Haram is going to be challenging because it's an ideological battle, and even if we have like missile strikes today, it could even potentially lead to the creation of more insurgency and more like Islamist terrorists in the northern region of Nigeria. So do you see this similarly? Do you think that this challenge can be overcome in Nigeria? And also and to DGG Daniels, you have mentioned that for Nigerian displaced persons, they are really looking for like handouts in comparison to other displaced persons in other countries. And I'm wondering if this is a result of the permanence of the situation. So is it because the displaced people and persons in Nigeria have kind of resigned to fate and they would rather look for ways to develop themselves in the new communities where they find themselves? And my second question is, what's the biggest challenge that IOM has faced in from an operational perspective in contributing to like the humanitarian policies in the affected regions of Nigeria? And lastly, I was wondering if there is any challenges that the host communities of newly displaced people feel, if there's some tension or conflict that IOM also faces while trying to settle some like newly displaced people into like new communities. And for Ambassador Sanders, during your time as an ambassador in Nigeria, do you see any difference in the way the Nigerian government responded at that time to the crisis or to the onset of the crisis during your time in Nigeria? If you compare it to what's going on right now, is there a difference? Do you think that the government was more effective then in combating issues in Nigeria as opposed to right now? Yeah.
Can the Boko Haram challenge be overcome? In the long term, every human problem can be solved, right? There's always a solution somewhere. Was the Jan Smoot, the South African statesman, said, when I think of history, I'm a pessimist. But when I think of prehistory, I'm an optimist. Sure. So you think in terms of decades, right? About this time, the previous century, Nazism was the problem. And if you told people at that time that there'll be very few Nazis running around right now, they would say, "Oh yeah, I'll take that." I'm similarly optimistic. The fundamental challenge with a group like Boko Haram, and this applies to similarly minded ideological groups, is if your solution is to, and this is the sexy word now, everybody says it, to be inclusive. Everybody likes that word, inclusiveness. What do you do with a group that says the very project of inclusion is what I'm against? The modus operandi, the vehicle, the spirit of it. And it does pose a challenge. There's no doubt in my mind that in the short term, militarily, you have to engage with those groups. But that you also, at the end of the day, you have to think more long term in terms of solutions. There are things you could do in the short term to drain the swamp, but it's going to take a while to get the message across to such groups. So short term, I'm pessimistic. Long term, I'm optimistic.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Gift, you gave me 3 questions.
Sorry.
So the first question is the point about why the handouts, the way IDPs, internally displaced people in Nigeria versus other countries. So I should preface that by saying that generally, if you go into any IDP camp or you're dealing with people who have been displaced, they want a long-term solution. They don't want to be reliable. They don't want to have to wait for a handout and the unpredictability of it. However, in the case of the IDPs in Nigeria, and I think it goes to a lot of the points Ambassador made, is that this is all they've ever known. This has been their reality. I mean, even if I think back to my Tatsine and when I was doing youth corps, so this has been reality for decades. So, and the point I was trying to make in my remarks was that they look for how to survive within this context. It's almost as if they don't have expectations of anything better. They've not known a better government. They've not known a better system of services. They've not, right? So that, I think, explains their approach when it comes to humanitarian assistance. Now, you also asked what are the biggest challenges that we faced. There are a couple. The first is that people will rely on what they have to cope. The savings, whatever savings they have, whatever assets they have, family members, etc. The thing is that the longer it lasts, the less people have to cope with, right? And how do you build resilience when the baseline is so low, right? So that's one. The second is about camps versus no camps. A camp, you have a catchment area. You have people that are easily accessible and you can engage. And you have some type of structure, as opposed to people who are in the community with a family member or somebody has allowed them to stay there. And the default is provide support in a camp. The reality is you have more people out of the camp and they're much harder to reach. And this brings me to, you asked the question about host communities. Host communities often say, we are almost as bad off as the IDPs. We have the same challenges with access to water, to education, to healthcare, to everything, but you're helping them. Mm-hmm. And we're not helping the host community and managing that dynamic. And then maybe the final challenge I want to speak about is it's very easy to be like, this is overwhelming. You can't deal with the government. Boko Haram is, or insurgents, insecurity everywhere. I mean, there's no government system how to engage. And this is what speaks to also the resilience of people, because we do find, and we have empirical data to support this, that they're what we call the pockets of fragility. There are certain areas that are stable enough for people to, I wouldn't go as far as saying thriving, but beyond surviving. There is some level of stability. And that's where we make our investments and try and grow the pockets. Because if you try and tackle the whole thing, it's very overwhelming. And therefore, we really try and identify, there are a whole bunch of criteria for how you identify these pockets of stability, but that's the way to be responsive and not be overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the challenge.
Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. And this has been a really, really interesting conversation. And I think I have 3 questions, one for each of you. And you may also contribute on each other's or one another's questions. So to Professor Obadare, I think this is a commonly asked question. And I would really like to know how we could analytically distinguish between state incapacity or strategic neglect. Like, is the Nigerian government really incapable of solving these problems, or they are intentionally looking the other way? And to DDG Daniels, pardon, I am wondering who manages displaced people, because I can imagine them moving around for so many times, and it kind of puts them in different under different management cares. So my dissertation is on exploring the relationship between migrants, and within migrants groups and between different migrant groups. And I am really concerned about the kind of violence that goes on within the migrant group, because I can imagine some of them are self-governing, outside of state care, and they are the ones calling the shots by themselves. And I'm wondering how much of a problem this poses to, like, organizations like the IOM. Like, what do they do, and how can this really be changed when the violence is from one migrant to the other, just because there is some form of imbalance of power? And the third question that I have for Ambassador Sanders, and that you may also all contribute on, is something that has been discussed in the Nigerian group. There was an argument about whether, all of you know about this, about whether we should be, how we're advocating for the Nigerian people and calling out the government. And so there was the argument about not shaming the Nigerian government, some of the opinion of shaming them and calling them to action like they did when eventually President Trump intervened. And some other people were like, it's just going to erode hope in the Nigerian people and also hurt the Nigerian reputation, which may eventually hurt the individual citizens of Nigeria on global stage or different international context. And I'm just wondering, how would you think we may engage on this? And thank you for giving us these actionable steps on how to engage with the community. But in terms of advocacy and demanding accountability from the government, how far could we go?
A couple of things about this. That at the end of the day, the first set of people you have to think about is the victims. I was in Abuja last year, and I went to the camp at Durumi. The conditions are just absolutely horrendous. And I remember each time I think about it, so I was on BBC doing an interview, just right after President Trump initiated the airstrikes on Christmas Day. And so we're going to, the journalist asked me, what do people in Nigeria think about it? I said, and I was on air, right? I said, I don't care what Nigerians think. And what came to my mind was the image of the picture I took with the woman, the leader of the group, the Mrs. Ayuba. And I went there to interview those people. You're going to hold this against me, but I'm very soft. I was interviewing them, I was doing the recording and all of that, and I just started crying. I was, and they were trying they were consoling me. I just broke down, right? Like, just thinking. So when I think about that, for me, the question is not whether President Tinubu is offended. The question is what it is we are doing to say help those people, the victims of Boko Haram. If we put our emotions before those people, so what is this? Like some kind of Hunger Games? Like what? So that's one. But for me too, the primary consideration for the intellectual is always, am I telling the truth? I don't speak for Nigerians. I don't speak for the Nigerian government. I don't think on a good day the Nigerian government, knowing what I know about it, and I'm sure what you know, knows what it thinks about anything. So for you to then think, oh, I hope I don't offend the Nigerian government. The Nigerian government does not even care about you, right? I think your first duty as an intellectual is always to say, this thing that I'm saying, number one, is it true? And is it anchored on solid evidentiary basis? And if people push back, can I justify? A quick personal anecdote. I don't want to hog it, but I was among the first people to start writing pro-LGBT before it became LGBT and the rest in Nigeria. And I remember the Reverend of Methodist Church, Elisha. The church actually wrote to me disowning me. No, I'm serious. I have the letter saying you're no longer one of us because you did this. The same church is now trying to give me an award, right? That's like 25 years ago. Each time I think about it, I'm always like, okay, I was doing what I thought was right. I'm still doing what I think is right. I have internal struggles with myself. But as long as I can look in the mirror and say, what I'm doing seems right to me, it really shouldn't matter to you what the rest of the world thinks. state incapacity versus state neglect. I think it's a mix of both in Nigeria. There's a kind of incapacity that morphs into neglect over a period. Is the Nigerian state capable of eliminating Boko Haram? Potentially it could. But part of what you see in Nigeria is that is the chickens coming home to roost. That those years of military rule, those years of disinvestment in military infrastructure, all those things are catching up with Nigeria. The problem right now is that even if Nigeria wanted to do something honestly and honestly, it really does not have the capacity and the professionalism to do it. Hence, that becomes a neglect of some sort because you then realize, why should I do this? Because I really don't have the. So I think, for me, I think for the most part, it's a mix of both. Sorry, I took so long.
I know, we're good. Thank you.
Before you pass the mic, because you just answered about state incapacity versus neglect, I was wondering, that ties into whether or not shaming is even effective. Because you people talked about whether we should be bothered about shaming, but you didn't really hit on what's the impact of the shaming, or of saying the truth. What's the point? Like, is this going to change the incapacity or what?
It's the legitimacy of the emotion that you should think about, right? Look, shame is a very strong word. And part of why people say it is they realize that the people they're addressing, the agency or the actors, are quote and unquote shameless, right? Seriously, that you like, we really need to shame these people. It's a commentary on the status of institutions, of agents or officials. If it works, right? Why not? When you're dealing with the kind of problem that you're dealing with in Nigeria, where there's an insurgency on the one hand and then you're dealing with official faithlessness on the other, I think every legitimate tool that you can bring to the table should be brought to the table.
If I can build on that. So for me, it's not about, it's interesting that you're having the debate in the group about shaming or not shaming. I assume you're all connected with home, you follow social media, there is shaming happening every single day. People in Nigeria, and I'm so proud of this, are relentless in their criticism of the government, right? So that is happening. But what my humble suggestion would be to all of you is, how are you constructively engaging? Right? How are you raising issues that confront the government's, whether it's the government's neglect or incapacity? How many of you are in the formal diaspora groups that, and there are these regular calls that what's her name? Abika Dabiri, what's her title? What's her title?
For diaspora.
NIDCOM is, anyway, she has these regular, I think they're monthly, or so, calls with Nigerians in diaspora on issues in Nigeria, right? There are quite a few platforms to effectively engage with the government on these issues. So for me, it's not so much, the focus shouldn't be, or shouldn't just be on the shaming. It should be on the constructive engagement with government actors or the different actors in Nigeria who have influence on whatever issue it is that you want to raise. As a UN, we are consistently presenting data to the government. I was in Nigeria for World Humanitarian Day. Can you imagine how I felt as a senior official of the UN reading out, we're the highest in severe and acute malnutrition, we're the highest in number of poor people, we're the highest in number of women dying in childbirth, we're the highest in child mortality. It is endless. And yet the UN is consistently engaged with successive governments with this data. To be honest, my hope is really in what the young people in Nigeria are doing. And I'll give you an example. As the UN and on migration, we work on reducing the cost of sending money home. And the global indicator is to bring it down from like 10% to something like 3%. And this has been there for the past maybe 15 years, and it's moved 1 or 2 percentage points. What did young people do? What's the name of the platform? There's, what is it? Tip, tap, tap?
Okay, tap, send.
You send it immediately, and it's a percentage. Not even a percentage, it's like a point percentage of the transfer. So yeah, tap, tap, tap. So Nigerians are innovating in the absence of a capable government with systems. We recently had, it was called Waka Well, but basically it's a hackathon. We couldn't do it in Nigeria. We did it in Nairobi, but it was mainly Nigerians, young Nigerians, where we put in front of them different problems, and they come up with digital solutions, which they were able to do, whether it's in terms of education, whether it's in terms of skills building. So it would be great if your advocacy, your research, the work that you're doing, your engagement is also linked up with these other groups that are trying to achieve change. I don't want to give up on government in the long term, but there is a lot that is happening in the short term to engage on. You asked the point about who manages IDPs. It's a really good question. Nobody manages IDPs. There's no UN entity or any entity for that matter that covers IDPs, which means that you have many different actors, would I say, managing IDPs. I think what is most important, aside from, what would I say, administrative structures, is understanding what the lived experience is and how we can ensure that a person, either in a situation of displacement or a vulnerable movement, how do we make it safe? And for the UN Migration Agency, we talk about a route, right? It could be a route from Nigeria to Algeria, Nigeria to the UK, wherever Nigerians are going. All along the route, how can we support people who are moving? And all along the route, it's not just us as IOM. There are a whole range of actors to support people, including bringing people home. Again, Nigeria is number 1 for IOM, for migrants who we return home, who have ended up in a vulnerable situation from all around the world, right? I'm very happy as a Nigerian that I can support the return of vulnerable migrants. I would prefer, however, that if migrants are moving, that they're not vulnerable, that they're, again, moving with safety and dignity and agency. So just to close on that, it's not so much about who is managing. It would be great, but in this current context, I don't think there's going to be an entity for managing IDPs. It's more about how we support both short term and in the long term.
Thank you. Can we start with Fumi? Please keep your questions very brief and also briefly introduce yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
what you're studying, because
Yes.
that was good to know where you were coming from on that question.
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Fumi. I'm a master's student here at Stanford. I'm doing aeronautics and astronautics engineering. Thank you for the talk. It's been a very interesting talk. I don't think I've ever been in this kind of settings before, so it's my first time. I do have a few questions for DDJ Daniels. I think from all of the discussions we've had today, it's very clear that this issue is a very big problem and it has to be solved in layers. Like there is not, just like what she said earlier, it's not like a cookie cutter thing. There are like multiple layers to this. There are multiple angles to tackling the problems. I think one of the things that I've just been thinking about since we've been talking about this is two keywords: equipping and empowering. And I'm wondering what are the kind of empowerment put in place prior to even having any form of violence happening. Like what are we doing in equipping the people living in this area, because you know that even if they go back to these places, there is still a high chance that they are still vulnerable to this violence. So what are we doing to help them to even prepare? You mentioned earlier that sometimes they do have early warning signs. They can see people gathering, they are sensing that, okay, maybe we may get attacked tonight or something, but they are still powerless regardless. So that warning is actually, they might as well not even have any warning because they're still not able to protect themselves from that. So I was wondering, what is the framework in place for actually equipping people for this kind of situation? Because I believe solving it is something that is going to be a continuous process and it's going to take a long time. But even as we are approaching, as we are tackling the solution, how are we empowering them so that they are able to protect themselves to some form of degree against these things? And I think the second thing that I wanted to mention is, when these people eventually get displaced to these temporary camps, I can imagine that there are so many kind of help they're going to need. Maybe they move to a new place, they don't even understand the language, a bunch of things that we can't even start to think about. I was wondering, is there a way that the general public are able to get involved in actually helping? Because I do know that sometimes a lot of people are willing to help that we actually know, but they don't even know how they can help. So, is there a way that the general public can be aware of these situations and how they can be a part of the solution as well?
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, can we have the four questions together? Yeah.
I'm going to be very quick, but start it off kind of with a little bit of setup. We've all had situations where we've had to change our minds about something. My name is Simi.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
My name is Simi. I study civil engineering and I work broadly in housing and low-cost housing. On this issue, we're talking about people with very strong ideological backgrounds, and that's why I opened with the idea of we have all had to change our minds about something. Moving forward in terms of Nigeria, violence, banditry, etc., requires really the toppling of someone's world, the restructuring of everything they know. And as we've all seen, many people are ready to fight to the death for what they believe. This does not, in my mind, seem like something that is just a regular research question. It seems like a big psychological, emotional, and mental undertaking that I've just never seen precedent for that kind of large mindset shift, maybe outside of the Nazis, right? I'm very curious, as someone who is not in that space, right? If someone could, any one of you could shed light on maybe what that process of dismantling these huge ideologies and these huge visions, because it goes all the way up and down. Sending girls to school, listening to women, thinking about life differently, thinking about the dignity of other humans differently. I've just never seen that done personally, and I want to learn more about how that is done.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, I'm Matthew, a PhD candidate in the Department of History. I have three questions, two to Professor Obadare and one to... They're quite structured. So for Professor Obadare, first is, how does the trans-regional mobility of armed bandits challenge or destabilize regionally grounded analysis of banditry identity? For example, like when armed groups operate across multiple states or border zones, as seen in northern Nigeria or, moving towards southwestern Nigeria, their movements often blur local distinction between outsiders and insiders, complicating how analysts attribute political, ethnic, or economic motivation. So how do we kind of deal with that? Second question to you is also about the networks and everyday life of banditry itself. So what do the porous networks connecting bandit groups to everyday populations reveal about social complicity, survival, and moral ambiguities within affected communities? For example, we might actually want to think about how some residents engage in informal trade or information exchange with bandits outside of economic necessity, raising questions about whether such entanglements reflect poverty-driven pragmatism, religious affiliation, or broader systematic disenfranchisement. Then the third question to DDG Daniels, when people move across borders from northern Nigeria to nearby countries, especially in times of crisis, what story does that tell us about insecurity and instability in the wider region? I mean, I'm just curious about how these movements connect with events like the 2021 coup in Mali, the 2023 coup in Niger, and the failed coup in Benin, where this movement have actually seen people moving into Nigeria and other neighboring countries. How do we make sense of these crisscrossing flows of people between equally unstable spaces? And what might this say about the nature of borders in West Africa? Are border really lines of safety or porous zones that both protect and expose community to?
Yes, Hepzibah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talks. I have like 6 questions.
Only?
I will read them. My questions are probably focused towards.
But first of all, who are you?
Yes.
I apologize. My name is Hepzibah. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Physics. So I'm not like an expert. I'm just a concerned citizen. Yeah. So my questions is more directed towards Middle Belt banditry and kind of like distinguishing between Middle Belt banditry to Northwestern banditry. So Professor Obadare mentioned that Boko Haram is an ideological problem, but the Middle Belt does not have an ideological problem. I've been to like Benue. Like if you're in Southwest, if you wake up 5 a.m., you hear Muslim, you hear this Muslim prayers. You don't hear that in Benue. That's like, I'm just trying to just point out the fact that Middle Belt people don't have the ideological problem. They don't cooperate with the bandits, and why is it difficult for the military to? Why is it difficult to have a military solution to Middle Belt banditry, which I feel like should be done with if we had the willpower with the government? So that's my first question. Also, the second question I have is that people also talk about the fact that, okay, most of the bandits, they use like this guerrilla tactics. Is it guerrilla tactics? I don't know the right pronunciation, whereby they attack and they go into hiding. But if we have like, I think, hundreds of thousands of displaced people in Benue, for example, which does not have like an ideological problem, and they are not able to return to their territories because most of the time it's reported that those territories are still occupied by these bandits. Then this no longer is guerrilla tactics anymore. It's the enemies are actually out in the public. They are not like in hiding anymore. Why is it difficult to have a military solution in that situation? So also I wanted to ask, why is bearing arms a solution to at least, for example, the Middle Belt? Bearing arms in Nigeria, for example, in Nigeria it's illegal to own arms, even though almost all the insurgent groups have a lot of arms. Why is it, bearing arms for allowing responsible citizens to bear arms, is that a reliable solution to solve most of the banditry problem, especially in the Middle Belt region that does not have like an ideological problem? So that's my third question. My fourth question. My fourth question is about the Niger brothers. It's closer to the question asked by Matthew. If countries really ask about influx of people from different countries, for example, from Niger to Nigeria, is the Nigerian government actually involved in? This is to Ugochi Daniels. Is the Nigerian government also monitoring the state of influx of citizens to the Niger border? And how is all of this related to, because for example, there was a killing in, the killing of the student in this university, I think it's in Jos, or the burning of this.
Yeah.
The person was actually stated to be a Niger citizen.
Are you talking about Deborah Yakubu?
Yes.
Yeah,
the girl.
In Sokoto
Yes,
State?
yes, that's Deborah.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's Nigerian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, anyway, ask your question.
Thank you. I heard that they mentioned that some of the people who did the video, some of them are Niger citizens. Maybe I'm wrong, but how much is Nigeria invested in getting this data about the influx of people from other countries who stabilize the system and cause more banditry? And the reason why I'm also asking this question is because you mentioned about the climate, which goes to my next question. You mentioned about the climate change problem, where you mentioned about the fact that the Chad River is drying up. But Nigeria, I don't think that problem is actually a problem of Nigeria. I think more countries in the far northern Nigeria, like Niger, Chad, Mali, all those, most of the Sahel countries should actually be more affected by the drying of Chad Basin compared to Nigeria. And you don't hear all these horrible records in Niger, you don't hear those horrible records in Chad. Why is it that Nigeria, we are talking about Chad drying up and Nigeria is having the worst records, even though the other countries in the Sahel should be having they should be doing very poorly regarding that. So, going back to the question I was trying to ask, can we say that most of the problem we have in Nigeria is because we have more influx of criminals from all these other Sahel countries, or I'm trying to find out what the right dynamics is in that situation. And my last...
We want to make Nigeria great again.
Last question.
My last question is to say that, is the solution to the problem of influx of criminals that we should leave ECOWAS? Is leaving ECOWAS a solution to that problem? I'm just like open to any problem that will make Nigeria.
Thank you. We'll come back for the second batch of questions after this one's have been answered. Or should we take a break?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, I'll be very quick because I know people are waiting. Yeah. Should we leave ECOWAS? No. We play a very pivotal role in the region. ECOWAS is one, I would say second to the EU, one of those models of regional cooperation that I think all of us Nigerians, Africans can be proud of. I'll keep it. Should Nigerians be able to bear arms? The answer for me is yes, but my ideological priors might be different from yours. I'm a firm believer in the idea that people should be able to protect their own lives. I know there's a whole spectrum I don't want to get into that, but should Nigerians be able to bear arms? Even without Boko Haram, my answer was always yes. Do you understand? So that's where I'm coming from. The relationship between banditry and Islamism is a very, very complex one. I try to tease out some of those complexities in my presentation. Banditry is a problem. If banditry were to be the only problem Nigeria has, then Nigeria has no problem because you can solve banditry. The much more interesting problem, because it's theological, which is what I was trying to pursue in my presentation, is Islamism, because it's theologically predicated. Can something of that nature be dismantled? I did say earlier that my answer is yes. So, but I gave the example of Nazism. Let me give you other examples. Think about slavery, right? Think about the whole idea that another human being can be the property of someone, right? This country went to war on account of that, right? Long after the British had become converted to the anti-slavery movement, there was a whole war that we had to fight in Africa to get people whose entire economy, whose entire life depended on keeping it going. That was a separate battle. But look at it right now, right? Nobody wants to be associated with something that infamous. It's taken how many centuries to get to where we are? It's not perfect, but it's an indication of how the mentality can change. Think about this homosexuality. It's taken how many decades to get to where we are right now? But that's a very remarkable mental shift in the way people think about stuff, right? So where we are 50 years ago, what got me over the line? I started reading about it, and then I read Andrew Sullivan's book, Virtually Normal. And I put it down, I was like, I'm convinced. Right? But I reacted, I was of the old school. But I'm now of the new school. I was persuaded. People can change their minds. And people, in fact, and this is the optimistic thing about history, people do, in fact, change their minds. Right? You see, let me add another example. Look at interracial marriage.
Sorry, but can you just say, but that can go either way.
But that's the point.
It comes with National Socialism. That is actually not a deep history. It's actually something that came very, very quickly.
Say that again.
Sorry?
Say that again, the latter part. What did you say about socialism? I didn't
National
get that.
Socialism was something that didn't have very deep history. It came very quickly. So in a way, I mean, I like the positive aspect that people can change their mind, but I would actually say National Socialism is a warning from history how quickly things can also go terribly wrong and even be even worse.
I completely agree. But the point is that the fact that something appears to be set in stone right now does not mean it can change. That I'm trying to leave out with something positive so that we don't think simply because the insurgency is there, it's been decades long, it's always going to be like that. No, it can change. The question is, what do you do to effect that change?
Framework.
Education, right? Yeah, just, I mean, look, anyway, okay. I don't want to. Yeah, well, thanks.
Yeah. So maybe a few reactions on my end. Leaving ECOWAS, no. I'm not a fan of ECOWAS. It's one of the most inefficient regional cooperation entities on the continent. However, ECOWAS gives a basis for country-to-country collaboration. And the issues that we're talking about require some platform or mechanism by which countries can engage. So no to leaving ECOWAS, and even the countries that left ECOWAS realized the importance of the interconnectedness in the region and left some aspects of the ECOWAS agreements in place. So that's one. You mentioned the issue about Lake Chad. You don't hear about Niger, Cameroon, Chad as being affected. They're all affected. In fact, the crisis in that, it's actually called the Lake Chad Basin issue, because all of the countries are affected. You hear more about Nigeria, you're Nigerian, and the numbers obviously for us are bigger. Yes, of course, the government is interested in monitoring who is who's in the country. Every country, from a security perspective, wants to know who is within their borders. But I think it goes to Matthew's question on what does it say about borders, and what I said previously. Borders are artificial. It's the same families, communities on either side of the border. And if you think back to the map from Professor Obadare's presentation, we have very long borders. There is zero expectation that the government can track everybody who is crossing those borders, which goes back to the point about why having mechanisms for regional cooperation are so important, and how Nigeria relates with its neighbors, because it cannot, enforce, secure the borders that it has. So the issue about coups in Mali and Niger and interest in tracking people moving. I hope you're aware that there was no increase in people moving on account of the coups. So it did not lead to greater instability, or did not lead to new displacement. And I was quite surprised and trusted to learn when I was in Nigeria. Our current minister for, I think it's called budget and planning, comes from Nasarawa. And he said from the time he remembers when he was growing up, that people would come, Malians would come down on the river to mine gold in the state. So the movements, so-called cross-border movements, it's not a new phenomenon. We've been doing this, or it has been happening for not just decades, but centuries. That is how, you're a student of history, you will know about the history in the region and trade in the region and how people move. And then, Simi, the question on strong ideological backgrounds, there's something called disassociation as part of DDRR, disassociation, demobilization, reintegration. And this is a technique or a practice that is used with what we call ex-combatants. A classic example, what we are doing as IOM in Nigeria with ex-combatants from Boko Haram who have not committed a grave violation, so not rape, not murder, and it includes 6 to 9 months of disassociation from the ideology. And in summary, I don't have time to go into great detail, but basically what it is they're using the Quran, they are able to disassociate the ex-combatants from the ideology of Boko Haram, and showing that what Boko Haram is doing is not in line with Islam. And this is a very specific example, but in across many countries where there has been these types of efforts to demobilize, demilitarize, disassociate, there's always a period of psychosocial support and engagement for the purposes of disassociation. So it is possible to do it. And I, to be honest, was quite impressed that it can be done in 6 months, 9 months. It's not something that takes 5 years or 10 years to happen. And then finally, Fumi, on equipping and empowerment, just to answer really quickly, there's the hard side, there's the soft side. So hard side are things like what you give them, right? I think what's actually more important is, there was one more thing. I think it was Idiba, Middle Belt and North, and the difference between what's happening in the Middle Belt and what's happening in the Northeast. As I said, I was in Benue State. The governor told me that the massacre that happened was actually retribution from many years past in terms of ethnic conflict, right? So it may not be banditry, but there are deep-rooted tribal, I shouldn't say tribal, different ethnic groups and what would I say? Retribution for previous grievances that they have. Now, the reason why I remembered it when I was responding to Fumi's question is because on the soft side, a lot of what we do with communities is on social cohesion. How do you support communities in conflict resolution, dispute resolution, peaceful tools for resolving the conflicts that they have? You know, going back to the point I made about the investments we make in areas where we see that there is some level of stability, a lot of it is on social cohesion, community building, restoration using local institutions. So community leaders, church leaders, religious leaders, ethnic leaders, because that is a really critical aspect to not just long-term solutions, but even short-term solutions that, to be honest, can be more effective than a military intervention. And in my discussions with, he was still Chief of CDS, Chief of Defense Staff, General Musa, he said exactly the same thing, that kinetic approaches are neither effective nor or sustainable in addressing the challenges that we have in Nigeria. Maybe that's why he's no longer CDS. But That was his thinking at the time. And so when it comes to equipping and empowering, always think of, I mean, yes, there's the physical things that they need, but what's actually more important and more time consuming are the soft aspects. And the final thing I will say when it comes to rape is that, and I've heard it not just from the women, but even from the men, that rape is about destroying the social fabric of a community. And it's playing out in the bodies of women and girls, and sometimes men and boys also. But they're trying to destroy what it is that is the strength of the community, which is more painful, harmful than destroying buildings or torching farmlands. It's what's inside. It's what's inside people. So when you think of equipping and empowering, you really have to think of the individual and then what it means for the family and for the community. And we put a lot of effort into that if we're going to get to long-term solutions.
I would have thought that, given everything I've said today and given my presentation, that nobody will go away thinking that I was unclear as to the distinction between Islamism and Islam. Every time I spoke, I said Islamism. I used Islamist insurgency. I never used Islam, not once. So I hope nobody goes away thinking I'm tarring an entire religion with the same brush. It's a distinction without a difference.
Where's the difference?
If I can't, I know.
Where's the difference?
How would you define Islamism? And how would you also define extremism?
Please, 1 second, please, 1 second. Namdi, please, 1 second. Can we have the next batch of questions within the next 3 minutes? Just ask your most pressing questions, please, and go straight to the point. Please, go straight to the point.
Impossible.
Yeah. I have questions for the speakers.
You can speak with him later, but we're already out of time.
I think the most pertinent one will go to Ambassador Sanders, and it's also in line with regional security as far as terrorism or jihadism is concerned in Nigeria. Now, if my analysis is correct, it would appear that there has been a sustained terrorist activities in Nigeria. The time of sustained terrorism activities in Nigeria is also coincide with the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. And there has to be questions also about the proliferation of arms. And when I'm talking about sustained jihadi or terrorist activities, I'm comparing to, say, other instances of Islamism in northern Nigeria, say the Maitatsan this thing, or even the one that implicated El Zaki, still in the northern part of Nigeria. So to what degree, in trying to answer this solution, you said, is it eradication or containment? To what extent can we also consider foreign intervention in terms of enhancing stability in Africa, in thinking about solution to terrorism in Nigeria and the border Sahel region?
Yeah, thank you. Can we have your question, please? Quickly, yes.
Yeah, it'll be very quick. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So my name is Tumi. I'm a first-year medical student. I had 2 questions, but I'm going to shorten it into one because of time. We're talking about incapacity versus neglect, and I'm usually someone who, I've done, my undergrad, abroad, so I've started to think about, Western involvement in issues that affect Nigeria, and so thinking about incapacity versus neglect, when it comes to neglect, I think about, what Nigeria can do, what we have the power to do, and then incapacity, I also think about it in terms of outside factors, like our history with, slavery and colonialism. So my point is, to what role or in what ways do we balance also, I guess the word could be reparations based off of our own, the ways we've been affected by colonialism and slavery versus also holding our government accountable for that, because I think that these 2 are things that usually come up in terms of the issues affecting Nigeria.
Yeah, Bidemi, can we have a question? Oh, David, okay. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is David Akomo. I am a Nigerian. I'm a PhD student in energy or candidate in energy science and engineering. And I have a couple of questions.
Ask your most pressing question, please.
Well,
Just, we don't have time, David, please. Ask your most
okay,
pressing
so
question.
in this conversation, I think somebody raised the point of how we can classify, I don't know, terrorism, banditry, conflict, violence, and can someone help me draw the lines between, say, Boko Haram and Islamic terrorism and migration of the pastoralist farmers, leading to farmer-header conflict in Nigeria, and whether they are completely unrelated or they should be viewed as problems that emanate from the same root cause.
Okay. Thank you, David. Bidemi or Dan? Yeah, then I ready. Yeah.
My question is, my name is Daniel. I'm a doctor. My question is, how much community participation can solve some of these problems? And in the general context, Nigeria is a country that most of these problems are solved at community level. Electricity, we have our generators. Food, we do our subsistence farming. I see that a lot of these intractable problems have almost never been solved by the government. There be a different approach in security where, whether it's local organizations, foreign organizations, and look at empowering, structuring communities to combat crisis. And we have that in Nigeria Delta when businessmen took over oil, and suddenly there's no more militant bombing, there's no more oil loss and all.
Yeah. Namdi, can we have your question briefly?
After Bidemi.
Okay. Very briefly, please.
So my question is more or less to the ambassador and also about the international community sort of. So, ambassador, how would you characterize the American engagement with Nigeria about the terrorism? Would you say they are dealing with it, stakeholder at the same level, about the sovereign nation in the engagement, or they are dealing with sort of, let's say, a puppet state in this case, saying the December bombing, or would you, the way I see it, and that's why I'm trying to question this is a foreign decision to pacify domestic peace, and we see it in the characterization of the president and how he used it.
What was the last part? A foreign what?
Like a foreign action from the
action.
US,
Okay.
just to pacify some foreign, some domestic base, and So because I can remember in 2014 when Nigeria really needed help with military equipment for Boko Haram, we got sort of short-handed by the Lai.
You mean the
Can you ask your exact
planes from
question,
South Africa?
So, I sort of put the question already. So how is what's different now?
Namdi.
From your time and from what the US is doing.
Okay.
Thank you, Namdi.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's no point bridging through all the questions I have. So one question to Gift. Why are we in a hurry? Are we going to get kicked out? What's the challenge with...
Yes, we're very short on time. We have to leave the room.
If the camera is turned off, can we just continue talking?
Maybe outside, yes. We can have that outside. Can we have your comments, please?
I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps doing National Security Affairs Fellowship. Have you considered the Ambar Awakening as a case study? Because it rhymes very much with the overarching things that the professor laid out as a community-based stabilization for human security. Thank you.
And how can yes?
My name is Halkano. I'm International Policy Security Major at Stanford. My question is, how do we deal with the misinformation and disinformation, especially on the ongoing counterinsurgency activities in Nigeria? Obadare.
Yeah. Did you hear the question? Okay.
Yeah. So I can't answer all the questions. I'm just going to mention two. I'll end with the Boko Haram thing, but my sister there, the question about colonial trauma, whatever, I want you to free yourself. African history goes back thousands of years. The colonial moment lasted at its high water, probably, I think, 60, 70 years, right? That's it. In the larger context of African history, it's a flash in the pan. It's gone. There's no trauma from it. Since the 50s and 60s, African countries have become independent. They own their lives. They own their agency. Do not borrow language from people who have no idea of African history. Don't impose it on yourself. African countries are full members of the international community. I did a piece on their reaction to what's going on in Iran. It's all over the map. Different countries doing different kinds of calculations, economic, cultural, geostrategic, political. We should own it. There is no colonial trauma. It's gone. Africa was not the only continent where colonialism took place. There were African countries that were not colonized. There were parts of Africa that made no contact with Europeans. Stop. It's done. There's no colonial trauma. Banditry and Boko Haram. So there's something that connects how Shabab, Iswap, how Jimmy. Just think about Lamurad, all of them. They are Islamist groups, meaning they say my interpretation of the Quran is right. On the basis of that, you're dead. They are Islamist groups. I never said once that they are Islamic. I call them Islamist to honor that distinction, that majority of Muslims reject their ideology.
Thank you very much for the question on misinformation. Look at the World Economic Forum report. They do a report every year on the top 10 global threats. The number one threat is misinformation and disinformation. So this is an issue, you applied it in this context, it cuts across pretty much everything. And trying to have something around global AI governance is fraught with many different problems. But I do want to appreciate the question because it is the reality. And I can speak as IOM or even as the UN, it's a big challenge for us as well. I don't have the solution to it, but there is recognition on the impact of misinformation. It's impacting elections, it's impacting a whole range of things, and there are efforts to try and not go as far as regulate it, but at least how to counter misinformation. And then he's gone. Yeah. But the point that he made around community-based stabilization is really at the heart of everything I was trying to explain. I don't have time to go into it, but there's also a practice around community policing. And what you need to what I hope you take away is that stabilization, long-term solutions, peace development, at the heart of it is the community and the way we engage with the community and the solutions that are community-driven and community-owned. The question on classifying, trying to make the distinction between Boko Haram, farmer, herder, banditry, that's not my area of expertise, but what I will say is that for the situation in Nigeria, it is a combination of all. And I think there was somebody that asked the point about, actually, I think it was you didn't say your name, the point about the fall of Gaddafi and what happened there. And it's true, we saw it with the fall of Gaddafi, we saw it with what happened in northwestern Syria. The bottom line is that when there's a vacuum of governance, it creates a vacuum which these type of actors thrive. From a migration perspective, and I had mentioned before that Nigerians are the #1 nationality for returns, vulnerable migrants. The biggest numbers come out of Libya, where there is no strong government structure, and militia groups and bandits actually are profiteering off the situation with migrants. And what we see in northern Nigeria and middle belt Nigeria just speaks to the do I go as far as saying vacuum? But what happens when you don't have strong governance systems in place, combined with poverty, what we call the development gap. And then on international, actually this is Bidemi, on international, the role, it kind of goes to Professor's point on colonialism. For me, there's a lot that can be said about the role of the international community, what they've done and what they've not done. I don't think that's what your focus should be. I think your focus should be on what our government is and is not doing, and how to support the initiatives, the locally owned community community-bred solutions. The final thing I will say is that if we are not supporting communities, it creates opportunities. I'll share a small story very quickly. I was in Adamawa State. The governor was very proudly showing us a hospital that he had put in place to cater to the needs of IDPs who were in the community, particularly pregnant women, which sounds fantastic, right? I get to the hospital, and what is the number one service they're providing? Dialysis. I'm like, why? No, don't laugh. It's a serious issue. Why dialysis? He said, because they're number one for liver disease in Nigeria. I said, why are you number one for liver disease in Nigeria? Illegal mining. Right? These are, and going back, people are looking for coping mechanisms. The solutions are going to be at the local level, and that's where we need to engage. Otherwise, in the absence of long-term solutions, they are going to make short-term decisions that have longer-term repercussions, such as liver disease from illegal mining. And the government says they spend $350 million a year subsidizing. Well, basically the dialysis is free. This is funding that could have gone to provision of basic services for the whole.
Thank you so much to everyone, and thank you so much to the events team for giving us some extra time. And I don't want to see the tension in the room today as a negative. These kind of conversations will always bring tension. So thank you to our three speakers, Professor Obadare, Ugochi Daniels, and Ambassador Sanders, for the clarity, candor, and depth they have brought to this conversation. And they have come from considerable distances and have given us their time and expertise generously, and we're deeply grateful for that. And thank you to everyone for the quality of your engagement as well. And I hope you have safe travels back to your destination.